I think we're ready for you for our first speaker of the day, and Leanne is actually the director of data science at the Financial Times, and she's a passionate data leader with experience building and developing empowered data science and analytics teams in a variety of businesses. Today my English is going to be hard, I see. Leanne is in her element when developing and implementing strategic, technical, and cultural solutions to getting machine learning and data science into the operational ecosystem. She's an active part of the data and technology community, sharing innovation and insights to encourage the best practice from Manchester, UK to Austin, Texas. Leanne, we're really so happy to have you here, and the stage is yours after the video.
I'm glad to see that some of you didn't party too hard wherever you were in Zagreb last night, and that you've been able to make it to me kicking off today's day of the conference. And a huge thank you to Data Science Conference, Alexander, and all the organisers, and Željko for running this year's Croatia 2022. And I'm really grateful to be here, so thanks so much for inviting me. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about Ethos of Process. And, you know, I think there's a lot to be said for us all to get a little bit comfortable with uncomfortable again. So when we think about the word process, what does it actually mean? So generally, a process is going to be a series of actions or steps that gets to some kind of end. And when we think about that in data science and machine learning, what we're actually thinking about is probably something like the CRISPR-DM lifecycle. So for those of you probably are all familiar with it, hopefully we've got lots of ML and data science practitioners in the room, but what you'll be doing is something along the lines of doing some business understanding, then doing some kind of data understanding by some kind of acquisition and exploration of your data. Then you will actually go on to prepare your data by cleaning and transforming it. You then might go away and do some modeling. You then want to go and validate and evaluate your model. And then finally, the step in the process is deployment. And I've always had an issue with this CRISPR-DM framework because my speciality has always been in this kind of deployment area, which is, well, data science isn't valuable unless the business can actually use it in an operational setting. And so when we look at kind of where the CRISPR-DM lifecycle came from, a lot of it had borrowed its practice from the software development lifecycle. It's very similar, but focused much more just on code, where you do some planning, you do some analysis of actually what the business needs, like a new application or a new front-end website. You'll design that using some kind of user experience. You then go away and implement the website or the app. Then you'll go and test and integrate it, and then you'll maintain it, and then you'll probably continue that life cycle so that you're constantly maintaining and iterating on that software engineering product. And so what happened in the software development world was that people looked at this and thought, well, how are we going to make it more efficient? You know, how are we going to actually improve our processes? And this was where Devops was born. So those of you, I'm sure everybody's familiar with the term Devops. But really where Devops came about was that we wanted to automate and speed up the software development lifecycle. And that was through version control, continuous integration, continuous deployment, agile software development processes, continuous monitoring, and then eventually infrastructure as code. So being able to ship your infrastructure for however you deploy your applications in software engineering as physical code so that it can be run anywhere. And so you have this kind of idea of code and running systems and all these tests so that you can constantly be maintaining your application. Well, when it came to machine learning, right, that's all well and good, but our data now suddenly becomes as important and as important in quality terms as our code did. And so because our machines are no longer just feeding logic from code, they're actually learning the logic from our data, we now have a new system where we're thinking, well, it's not just about the code, it's also about data. But actually, if we go back to that CRISPR-DM lifecycle, we don't really think about data as part of that process. We're still just borrowing a lot of our code processes. And so people much smarter than I over at Pachyderm came up with this idea that actually code and data need to live symbiotically together in this beautiful loop. And essentially you have a code loop, which allows you to iterate on your machine learning code. And then you also have a data loop, which allows you to do your developments with data. And so that means that both of these systems where you're going through, you're collecting your data, you're analysing it, is living in a lovely harmony with the code that you're writing. All sounds very ideal, right? I think anybody that actually does data science, machine learning, which I believe is a lot of you in the room, know that it's not as ideal as that sounds. So when we look back to our DevOps process, what we realise is actually we need to start thinking a lot more about how does this DevOps process actually think about our data. And so where we need to get to is that in DevOps we're constantly trying to find bugs in our data, in our code, sorry, and now in our machine learning processes what we want to be doing is identifying bugs in our data. But bugs could mean anything in data, it's not as simple as code, right? Because bug could be a bias, an inherent bias that you've baked into your data because actually you only have a select sample of the populace. But it could also mean that actually some chaotic event like COVID-19 has come around and disrupted your data. It could also just mean that something in your operational ecosystem in terms of the way that the data gets to you as a data science practitioner actually has been corrupted by some kind of malignant kind of system. And so maybe, you know, what should have been appearing as a value between 0 and 1 is now appearing as a null, and you need to be able to catch that. And so where we kind of built a lot of our processes today is actually thinking about, okay, how do we capture not just the machine learning code bugs, but also how do we actually capture our data bugs? And that's a really difficult thing to do because building continuous integration, continuous development, or continuous machine learning is actually not a simple problem. And so where we've kind of landed in terms of what we think about as our process in data science today is something like the CRISP ML framework, where you go through this kind of business data understanding, like we talked about earlier, similar to the original CRISP DM. And then you go into this idea of then the development and the operational cycle, where it's an iterative process where it's similar to kind of the DevOps lifecycle in software engineering, where it's feeding back into each other. So once you've created something that you want to put in production, you now have to continue to maintain it. And so my view on this is that it looks something a little bit like this, where you'll kind of ideate your kind of needs, and you'll come up with a machine learning use case for your business problem. You'll then go into that phase of business understanding to actually understand the user experience, no matter who the user is, but the end user was problem solving for. You understand the data that you have, same process as before, acquiring some data, exploring it, cleaning up that data and transforming it, and then going into your feature engineering before you do kind of model experimentation, tuning your model validation and evaluation, and then going into model deployment, where actually then you have the model serving, which is all of these kind of data bugs and code bugs, and monitoring and maintaining those that you can go in and fix. And what you'll see is, and this is a continuous loop that goes back into business understanding. So, all well and good, right? I've solved all of your business process problems in machine learning. That's it. I'm going to drop mic and go home. Well, the fact is that there's been a complete proliferation of tools in this space. And it's becoming completely impossible for us as data scientists to even know where to start sometimes. So we've got loads and loads of tools to help us to actually kind of bake data science into our business processes. But actually the reality is that tech is easy and process is really, really hard. Now, similar to David's talk yesterday, I'm not here to teach you all to suck eggs today, but one of the things I do want to do is talk to you a little bit about some of the things that we often have overlooked, or I believe we overlook in our processes and our approach to our processes when we go through these iterative cycles. And the first thing, as per my name of my talk, is that we really need to start getting comfortable with uncomfortable. What I mean by this is that in data science, it's kind of been taken for granted that we kind of already know what we're doing. The hype cycle has kind of been and passed, now businesses just expect, okay, I want some of that data science, I want some of that machine learning, or even worse, I And the reality is that actually we're really still quite nascent in our field. By that I mean we're still evolving, it's still really new, we still haven't quite worked it out. And my thinking is actually we're kind of like Goldilocks in the story of the three bears, where, you know, she's trying out some of the breakfast, she's a bit like, oh, this one's a bit too hot, and this one's a bit too cold, and this one's a bit bright. And so we're looking to our left and we're saying, software engineering, oh, what do you do about this problem? And we're looking to our right and we're saying, oh, what about project management? What do you do in this situation? And we're kind of borrowing and we're trying on different things and trying to see what fits kind of a bit right for us in machine learning. But actually, we need to kind of take a little bit of a step back and think, maybe we don't want to borrow, and maybe we want to kind of invent what works best for us. And I don't think we've kind of figured that out yet, and the problem is we're in a race against time, because businesses want data science yesterday. But the reality is we don't actually have all of the processes and the ways of doing it to actually make it always successful. And so doubt is a pretty uncomfortable condition, as Voltaire has said, but certainty is a ridiculous one. So one of the things I want us all to be going back to our businesses and championing is actually it's okay to not know how to do this data science thing perfectly. And I really firmly believe that our model process is very iterative, right? We look, we build something, we build like a minimal viable product, we put it out into our ecosystem, we address it, we say, does that work for us? But we don't scrutinize the actual way that we do data science enough. And I think what we need to be doing is thinking, okay, actually, how are we doing this thing? Are we approaching it in the right way? My next bugbear that I'm going to chat to you about today is that we need to stop justifying data science pounds. Okay, so generally there's kind of this consensus now in the industry which is like, oh, you want to build a data science team. Tell me how much revenue that data science team is going to make. And you'll hear a business turn around and say, right, let me know the ROI on that data science project. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't be doing that. I think it's a really good lighthouse. So a North Star where you're like, you can say, this project is going to roughly bring in this kind of revenue for us. But what I don't want us to do is keep hanging all of our capability on these magical pound numbers that data science can bring in. And that's because whilst businesses want to be able to justify actually this huge new AI kind of capability they've built in is actually going to bring them in loads and loads of money, which it will, calculating ROI is really hard. And there's a few big reasons for this, right? You look at what ROI actually is, well, it's your gains minus your cost of investment over your cost of investment. Calculating your gains is really complex if a product already exists, right? It's just a known fact, whether it's in data science or not. In terms of cost of investment, you have just too many cost unknowns in the world of data science. If you think what we're doing is we're delivering predictions, right? Predictions are inherently, by definition, unpredictable, and always just a proxy for an actual probability. So actually being able to therefore explain to a business why your prediction is as a proxy for a probability, and therefore the estimate of the value that this project is going to bring is actually just a best guess, starts to make the business second question, actually, do we want this AI thing to begin with, and starts giving AI a bit of a bad rep, machine learning. I think as well, you've got to start thinking about how you're going to justify the experiments that never get deployed, because if you start looking at your balance sheet and saying, okay, well, how are we going to say if we can make 3 million over here, but actually the cost of this failed experiment cost us 3.5 million because of all the, all the infrastructure and groundwork that we had for a project that failed. Actually, you could start to quickly end up in negative revenue if you're not careful with kind of how you approach this. Also, our cost of investments are just huge because they're across a huge range of the data suite. So how do you actually justify what comes from a really good data platform and data warehouse team who's actually maintaining all your beautiful data before you then actually build your machine learning product on top of it? And also, how do you say, okay, and how much of this is going to be attributed to, say, a data governance team who are also vital to this process? And then finally, your gains can come in many forms, right? So if you're doing some kind of optimization or efficiency, how are you going to justify that versus a new product development which is actually going to generate lots more money? And you might end up focusing on the wrong problems. So, these calculations are complicated because the value isn't all in just one number, and it's often spread across multiple departments, teams, business units, and programs of work. And measuring ROI for a data science project generally ends up as a project in itself, and that project in itself is really difficult to justify. So what I'm here today to say is absolutely use a benchmark of a number to kind of convince your business and persuade them, but don't hang all your laurels on it, right? So don't then rest everything to then justify back that number. So you're going to be asking, well, what can we do instead? Andrew Humes recently just gave, in his ML production course, some really good ideas about mapping business metrics back to and thinking about your diligence or value. What my suggestion is that what we want to be doing is telling compelling stories around the mapped business metrics. So, for example, if you have an NLE metric for around the performance of your model, that might be something, say you've just deployed some kind of new natural language process capability that, I don't know, detects, in my case, the Financial Times, it might detect certain keywords in an article. Well, you're, as a data scientist or a machine learning practitioner, you're focused on how accurate is my keywords detection, and then at the query level, how can I get that back from every, what's my kind of my recall, so how many keywords do I get back from all my articles, and then actually, am I getting back that if I was doing it in a search bar, and then what does that mean for the user, the business story? Well, then that'll be mapping to user engagement, and then to revenue. So it's not saying don't think about revenue, it's just thinking about all that piece of the story that maps you back from your precision or your performance metric in your model and the journey that it gets there to revenue, rather than thinking about that whole attribution of value process. And you kind of need the technical and the business teams to be able to agree on the metrics that they are both comfortable with before the project starts. I think as well, maintenance is one of the big areas that's often overlooked still. I think we're very obsessed, and I am in the data science teams that I run today, on always building out the new, latest model. And not thinking about actually, the thing is that steps can get done in a process, but your model never will be. And that's okay. Businesses need to get okay with that, because the fundamental thing is we're building services. Our models are predictive services or capabilities, and therefore they have to be treated like products where you kind of revisit them, retune them, rebuild them. And so, if you looked at the Netflix website back in, I think this is one from 2007 here on your left, and you look at it today in terms of kind of where we are today, the Netflix website has evolved, right? But I can pretty much guarantee you that someone in this audience, I'm not going to put up my hand, but I can guarantee I have my own zombies of this, is that you've got some kind of prediction of churn model wasting away that you wrote in 2017 that's still doing some kind of zombie process that no one has revisited. No one has actually said, has my data changed? Has my code changed? Actually, has my business process changed and updated that model? And everybody's going to be guilty of those models that we have wasting away in production, doing something where the marketing team says, hey, please don't turn that off, I need that. And that one person in finance is like, hey, that's running my whole finance ecosystem. And actually the reality was all they really needed was an Excel spreadsheet and not a machine learning model to do something. So what I want us to be is a lot more braver and make much more regular time to do qualitative and quantitative research on your models and outputs. And what I mean by that is go and speak to your end users and get your user research team involved. Get them to do some qualitative research, survey who's using your models, and ask them how are they using their models. Okay, it's one thing is actually getting the monitoring from your model about actually who's using it, but actually then getting the perspective of how it's being used is fundamental. You can then use that to empower yourself to kill off and deprecate projects that are no longer in use. So you can actually now justify to your business, if you want to kill something, then you've got some qualitative research to actually say, hey, this model is no longer practical. And I think as well, you have to do this assessment with respect to any projects that have high maintenance resource or costs. So if something is whirring away on a huge expensive GPU because it was a fun project that you built, doing some image classification, and there's now only one very small corner of the business, one person sat in IT who's using that thing, you need to think very considerably about, is that worthwhile continuing to have? And if you do want to continue it, then go ahead and actually improve that process and get more users using it. I think we have to focus on bringing projects from MVP to mature, and we have to be able to start saying to businesses, it's okay to do a one-off MVP to justify kind of whether or not machine learning has a use case here. But once we build it and actually the business starts consuming it operationally, there has to be an investment of people, resource, time, and effort to then bring that MVP right through to an actual product that then continues to be maintained. And I very, very much encourage you all to have some kind of process in place, even if for now, the one thing you will do is go back and say, right, once every 2 months, we're going to have a rota where we review every production project, so any machine learning that we have in production, and we're going to assess the ethics, the governance, the bias, the data divergence, and any edge cases that could be creeping through in your automated testing, and any manual reliability evaluation. So that's a manual process on top of any CI/CD that you may be doing on your models today. Next thing is to start addressing your own needs. So if you're in the healthcare world, it's very regulated, right? So you might be looking to this process and say, right, okay, what tools are out there? Oh, I've seen this great new tool that's going to get me to deployment into production within 30 minutes, right? So I can build a model, and I can actually get it deployed into my infrastructure for somebody else in, say, the other part of the business to start consuming my insights. That might be like a doctor at the end of his PC, like being able to evaluate somebody. But the thing is that healthcare is really, really regulated. So the reality is you don't need quick deployment cycles, because actually what you're going to have is a whole bunch of federation around actually, evaluating whether this model should actually go in front of client in terms of kind of customer, in terms of healthcare clients. Should it actually go in front of a doctor who could be making decisions off of that? And so, in the regulated industries, we don't really care about quick deployment. But in a very highly commercial, competitive space, perhaps in the telco industry, actually quick deployment cycles are probably what you're after. And so when you're thinking about your processes, make sure that whatever you're doing actually is for your own needs. And don't get swayed by a tool just because it sounds good, but actually think about, okay, what is the practicalities of the things I'm doing, and what am I willing to give and take on? So what are the things that maybe are my musts, what are the things that are my shoulds in terms of my process, and what are my nice to haves? And again, in a federated industry, I think the quick deployment cycle is a nice to have, certainly not a must. I think this doesn't happen without having all the right people in place. And for a long time, we thought about, the ecosystem of ML is sort of, have a data scientist, have a data analytics engineer, a machine learning engineer, an ML ops engineer to put everything in production, an ML scientist. And then we got very creative and we were like, actually, these people are actually doing some really cool things under the hood. There's some people who are doing some nice data translation, being able to kind of explain to our businesses what we're actually up to. There's some really people who are really good at exploratory data analysis, so let's call them the data explorer. Some people who do some great visualization, people who are excellent at statistical algorithms and machine learning algorithms and deep learning, so let's give them a nice title of the modeler. Data product owners has become really popular, and that's because I'm talking about process that has a product underneath it, right? So let's make somebody own all of this. And then the data storyteller, so somebody who can go around and actually sell actually the capabilities that we're building. Well, I'm not convinced by all of this. I think the reality is that actually what we need is what we've needed in businesses for the last 50 years, which is a delivery manager, a product manager, certainly a change manager, because what you're deploying is fundamentally changes to a process in an end user's environment, right? So whatever prediction that you do is going to change the way somebody works. So for example, if you're just deploying a churn model that says, okay, this person is going to leave our business in some, in the next 30 days, then maybe a marketing assistant has to then consume that into their marketing campaigns. That's a fundamental change in the way that they do their work. You need change managers to help you on that process and to educate and to get people comfortable with that change, because otherwise you could deploy something and it will never have operational success. We need lots more user research investment in machine learning. We often just plow in with data at our heart rather than actually thinking, what are people wanting? We're very guilty of this sometimes at the Financial Times, and it's something that I actually am very proud of that we do a lot better is we think, well, a lot of people that read the Financial Times don't actually want to know that their big brother is watching them in terms of they want to be able to ingest whatever news they feel comfortable with. The FT is a very transparent, independent, and fair news paper, and so our news agenda is very fair and transparent. What they don't want, therefore, is data science coming in and saying, right, you've read this article, so the next article you should read is this one. And why we knew that is because our user research says so. So what we use is a lot of our user research to actually inform what type of models should we be building rather than the models that we can be building. Because that's where we get into this big brother effect of the general human populace getting really scared of machine learning, because actually what they want to do is not necessarily what we end up building for them. And other types of business roles, such as product manager, business analyst, solution architect, certainly governance and strategy, and as I've talked about as well, user design and experience in terms of your front-end website or your application. All really important parts in the machine learning process, and these are more of the roles that I think we should be seeing in our field. I think one of the things that we can often think about is that oh, I made a decision and it came out with a really bad process, so actually I made a bad decision. Well, I don't believe there are bad decisions. There's some bad decisions, but generally the people that I meet and the people that I work with generally really informed, right? We're all quite analytical people in the machine learning space, and so generally we will gather lots of information together before we make a good decision. So to me, there are only good decisions that can have bad outcomes, right? And so, when you're coming through this process and you're thinking, right, where am I going to start? What tech shall I choose to use my latest, my latest NLP model? Shall I use Spacey or shall I go to Hugging Face? To be honest, it doesn't really matter, right? Just make a decision and start with it and then review. This is our tech stack here at the FT. Probably looks pretty retro, actually. We use a lot of R, our CI capabilities done in Circle CI, using a lot of tidy models, tidyverse, using our Studio to connect to deploy. But you know what? It works for us. We've made it work, and that's okay. We keep scrutinizing, is this working for us at the moment? And maybe some of the decisions that we've made, 3 or 4 years ago, are not the decisions that we would make today. But we're making it work. We're okay to swap in bits and pieces out of here. So we're starting to now use a lot more Docker in our life cycle. I think as well, ethics and governance are really just not steps in the process, and that's why you haven't seen them in the CRISP ML queue, but are actually really, really fundamental to it. And generally, we sit down and we think, right, we've built a model now, and I'm going to now assess, right, the ethics and compliance of that. And generally, it'll be especially here in Europe, right, I'll do some GDPR compliance around my model. And the thing is that we need to, instead of just making this a really boring checklist for us all, change our perspective and think at each step in the process what the ethics considerations I have around this. And what I mean around that is that there's inherently going to be issues with what you do at every stage, right? You are doubtless going to have some kind of bias in your data, whether or not you like it or not. But what you need to do is document that really, really well, so that it is ingrained in the history of the product, that at that time you only had a subsample of customers that were this. And be honest with it. It's okay to be honest with it, because otherwise it's going to come back and bite you much later down the line if you deploy something that actually, at the time, you only had a few hundred users to be actually to build on. And that's okay, like I said, as long as you document that, so that the next people who come on to maintain that product say, oh wait, this machine learning model was actually only built on, females between the ages of 35 and 40. Well, that's a bit of a problem, because actually we sell to a whole bunch of customers. Doesn't matter their gender, and it also doesn't matter their age. But if it's documented, well, then what the rest of the team can do if you move on is make sure that actually they can rebuild the model in a much more fair and compliant way. My final advice for today is the thing that kind of I think I see most in my career, which is just kind of for us all to get okay with people not getting machine learning. And I cannot tell you how often, I mean, my data science team at the Financial Times has been around for about 5 years. I joined the Financial Times last July, and I'm still going to exec board meetings to explain what is data science. What is data science 101? Here's what data science can do for us as a business. We've been delivering it for the last 5 years, right? And I think we need to remember that we're still in this era where, companies still think that machine learning is something like, get some data, do some magic, and then here's some value, right? And actually, the reality is, we all know there's a heck of a lot of work that has to go underneath that. In our data process, from selecting, sorting, synthesizing our data, right through to actually doing the machine learning in terms of the data engineering, from exploration, feature engineering, and then the modeling itself in terms of actually selecting the most viable model, training, evaluating and tuning it, and then actually getting that into production through that operationalized process. So that would be like registering your model, deploying it, monitoring it, and actually then maintaining and retraining the model. And that's all underpinned by really important things in terms of our legal approaches, ethical transparency, any historical biases, and our security. So these are actually, like here, it was actually Andy Scherpenberg who I've taken this image and I've repurposed it myself, but I kept this in order to adhere constraints. But actually, I feel like this should be fundamentals here on the left, because it's some of the things that businesses end up hiring after they've created a machine learning capability, but not before it. And the one thing I really like about the reason why I wanted to join the Financial Times is because we actually have a data governance team who I can lean into, and they were there for us in data science. And if you go to your business executives and you say, oh, okay, actually this is how we do data science, they're not going to actually understand any of this. And the reality is that what you're doing with your business is a heck of a lot of championing. So, in the ideation stage, you're information gathering about your business, prioritizing, and then all over your process you're documenting. And then in this kind of deployment stage, really all we're having to do is we're champion, going back, selling to the business, right? And then when you actually want to then retrain and look and you see problems in your model, you don't actually, a business process has changed, you want to improve it, then you've got to actually go and justify, like, okay, we need to rebuild this thing because something has changed in our sales strategy, so therefore that means that my machine learning model is no longer going to be working the way it was originally designed, because there's a change that's going to change our data. And this is a lot of sales pitching, right? And we've got to get people a lot more comfortable with going in front of kind of, exec level people to be able to sponsor around, okay, actually, why do we have to do all of this process? And fundamentally, organizational alignment is still vital. Your IT or your data strategy has to be aligned with your business one. And if you're off building very much research-based capability that isn't in line with actually where the business strategy is going, your data science team is being set up to fail. So definitely make sure to address that. So coming back full circle, the process is a series of actions or steps in order to achieve a particular end. Well, I have a particular issue with this word end in this definition. If we think about end as an outcome, well, what I've discussed here today is that, data science does have outcomes. We do produce models, but we have to be continually going through that process. And we do focus a heck of a lot in machine learning on building good outcomes. But actually, the reality is that we need to continue, and if you're not already, start focusing on building good process. Because if we have the process, then our outcomes are much more likely to be successful. is everything I had to talk to you all about today. I think I've left myself some time for questions. Thank you.
Do you maybe have any questions? I'm sure somebody has some, or it's too early maybe.
Maybe everybody needs their coffee.
Yeah.
Well,
So we have one here.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I would like to ask, in your team, do you have some rules, spoken or unspoken, or agreements which help you work better together with data scientists? Like some organizational collaboration or something that helps working?
yeah, lots. Great question. Thank you. Happy to continue chatting after this as well, but the key things I would chat about is that you need to make sure that you have some kind of fixed com plan in your team. So how are you actually going to communicate as a team, particularly in the hybrid world, right? So putting in fixed times, whether that be stand-ups, whether that be weekly team meetings, whether that be team sessions where actually one data science team is working on one project, gets together with another data science team and presents back and has a kind of a retro opportunity to have their work kind of evaluated by completely clean eyes who've not been involved in that process. You have to factor all of those into your daily working life, and you need to schedule the times in to make sure that happens. So what I prefer to do is be very proactive with that time, schedule the time in, and then if it's not needed, you can just delete it from the calendar and actually be very strong with that. So it's like, if no one has anything to present and kind of get scrutinized as kind of in work in progress, absolutely fine, let's cancel that session out. But have those times in where you can be collaborating together, where you have that freedom of thought and people can be very open to sharing what they're working on. And I think the other thing that has to go hand in hand with that is a culture of kind of safe psychological safety. So I could give a week-long presentation about cultures of psychological safety, but the main thing there is it's all done in the small steps. So when people are coming up with, actually, why didn't you use this model? Not allowing somebody else to kind of interfere and like let that discussion play out. Not kind of being quick to kind of judge different people's processes and encouraging the kind of very safe environment. And again, in a hybrid world, that's really, really hard to do, but it's very much led from the top, I believe, which is all around kind of how do you allow your team to express themselves? Because it's all well and good putting time in the diary, but then if nobody wants to say anything, then you're kind of back at kind of stage one. So kind of those two things have to work hand in hand, whereas creating confidence for people to be able to speak up and then creating the platform for them to actually be able to speak up and collaborate. Hopefully that helps.
Do you maybe have another one? No? That's it.
Well, I will be here for the rest of the day, so if anybody wants to come and pick my brain, or if you have any feedback about my presentation, maybe you are like, actually, this doesn't make sense, I really would love to hear from you. And thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.